The morning mist clung to the Rapidan River like smoke from 1,000 campfires, and Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant knew that by nightfall, the smoke would be real. It was May 4, 1864, and the fate of a nation balanced on the edge of a Virginia wilderness that would soon earn its name in blood. Grant sat astride his horse Cincinnati, watching as the Army of the Potomac began its crossing at Germanna Ford, 18 miles west of Fredericksburg. The river ran dark beneath the wooden pontoon bridges, carrying with it the weight of 3 years of war and the hopes of a Union desperate for victory. Behind him, 120,000 men stretched back along the muddy roads, the largest army ever assembled on American soil, and perhaps the last chance to end this brutal conflict. The wilderness ahead was no ordinary battlefield. Dense thickets of oak and pine intertwined with thorny underbrush that could swallow entire regiments, turning ordered battle lines into confused mobs of struggling men. Local Virginians called it the wilderness for good reason. It was a place where armies came to die, where the very landscape seemed to conspire against those who dared enter its green embrace. As recorded in historical accounts from the National Park Service, the strategic situation mirrored previous campaigns, but Grant had no intention of repeating the mistakes of his predecessors. Unlike the cautious generals who had commanded before him, Grant carried President Abraham Lincoln's explicit directive: destroy Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, whatever the cost. Across the river, Confederate scouts watched the massive federal column with growing alarm. Word raced south along dusty roads to Orange Courthouse, where General Robert E. Lee maintained his headquarters. The Gray Fox, as his men called him, had been expecting this moment. At 57, Lee commanded the respect and near worship of his troops, but he knew his army was a shadow of its former strength. Only 60,000 men remained under his command, many of them boys too young to shave and old men too proud to quit. Lee's strategy was elegantly simple and desperately dangerous. Rather than wait behind his fortifications along Mine Run, he would strike Grant in the wilderness itself, where the Union's numerical superiority would count for nothing. In that tangled maze of vegetation, a smaller force could fight as equals, and Lee's men knew every deer path and stream crossing. The first Federal troops crossed at dawn, their boots echoing hollowly on the pontoon planks. Major General Gouverneur K. Warren's 5th Corps led the way, followed by Major General John Sedgwick's 6th Corps. The men moved with the grim determination of veterans who had seen too much death, their uniforms faded from countless campaigns, their faces marked by battles at Gettysburg, Antietam, and Fredericksburg. As the morning wore on, the crossing continued with mechanical precision. Supply wagons creaked across the bridges, their wheels churning the Virginia mud into a chocolate-colored soup. Artillery pieces followed, their bronze barrels gleaming in the filtered sunlight. The very air seemed to vibrate with the movement of so many men and machines, all converging on a patch of wilderness that would soon become synonymous with American sacrifice. Grant himself crossed at midday, his staff officers flanking him like a protective wall. He had promised Lincoln results, and he meant to deliver them. Behind his calm exterior, the general-in-chief calculated distances and timing with the precision of a clockmaker. If all went according to plan, they would pass through the wilderness in a single day and force Lee to fight in open country where Union numbers would tell. But Robert E. Lee had different plans, and as the afternoon shadows lengthened, Confederate columns were already moving through the same wilderness roads, racing to intercept Grant's army before it could escape the Green Trap. The stage was set for one of the war's most brutal encounters, a battle that would test not just military tactics but the very soul of American resolve. By 4 o'clock on the afternoon of May 4th, the lead elements of Warren's 5th Corps had reached the crossroads hamlet of Wilderness Tavern, where the Orange Turnpike intersected with the Germanna Plank Road. The men were dusty and tired from the day's march, but their spirits remained high. For once, they seemed to have stolen a march on Robert E. Lee. That illusion shattered at dawn on May 5th when Confederate artillery opened fire from the woods along the Orange Turnpike. The shells came screaming through the morning air like harbingers of hell, exploding among the Federal camps with deadly precision. Men who had been boiling coffee around their campfires suddenly found themselves diving for cover behind trees and fallen logs. Major General Richard S. Ewell's 2nd Corps had arrived during the night, moving with the stealth that had made Confederate troops legendary. The one-legged general, nicknamed Old Bald Head by his men, had positioned his forces along the turnpike with the eye of a veteran who had learned his trade under Stonewall Jackson. His men were outnumbered 3-1, but in the wilderness, numbers meant less than knowledge of the terrain. The battle began in earnest when Brigadier General Charles Griffin's division of the 5th Corps advanced along the turnpike to drive back what they assumed was a Confederate screening force. The Federal troops moved in perfect parade ground formation, their bayonets fixed and their battle flags snapping in the morning breeze. They had gone less than a mile when the woods erupted in muzzle flashes and the distinctive rebel yell that had terrorized Union armies for 3 years. The fighting was unlike anything the veterans had experienced. In the dense underbrush, battle lines dissolved into individual struggles for survival. Men fought at ranges so close they could see the fear in their enemies' eyes, firing through gaps in the vegetation at muzzle flashes and shadows. The thick canopy of leaves filtered the sunlight into an eerie green twilight that made it nearly impossible to distinguish friend from foe. On the orange plank road, 2 miles south of the turnpike fighting, another collision was brewing. Lieutenant General Ambrose Powell Hill's 3rd Corps was racing eastward to join the battle, their ranks thinned by months of hard campaigning but their determination undiminished. Hill himself was ill, suffering from the chronic ailments that plagued many Confederate commanders, but he drove his men forward with the urgency of a general who knew this might be the South's last chance for victory. Brigadier General George W. Getty's division of the 6th Corps met Hill's advance guard at the intersection known as Parker's Store. The sound of their collision echoed through the forest like thunder, and within minutes, both sides were feeding more troops into the growing conflagration. The wilderness seemed to swallow entire regiments, its vegetation so thick that regimental commanders lost contact with their own companies. Grant, meanwhile, had established his headquarters at a farmhouse near Wilderness Tavern, where he sat on a tree stump reading dispatches and smoking his ever-present cigar. The general's calm demeanor masked a growing concern as reports filtered in from the fighting fronts. This was not the quick passage through the wilderness he had envisioned, and every hour of delay gave Lee more time to concentrate his forces. The battle's intensity escalated throughout the morning as both armies fed more units into the meat grinder. The wilderness began to live up to its sinister reputation as a place where armies came to die. Wounded men crawled through the underbrush, calling for help that often never came. The thick vegetation made it nearly impossible for stretcher-bearers to reach the casualties, and many of the wounded simply disappeared into the green maze, their fate unknown. As the sun reached its zenith, the sound of battle had grown to a continuous roar that could be heard for miles. The wilderness had become a cauldron of violence, and both Grant and Lee knew that the next 24 hours would determine not just the outcome of this battle, but perhaps the fate of the American nation itself. The second day of battle dawned with an ominous stillness that veteran soldiers recognized as the calm before a storm of unprecedented fury. May 6, 1864, would be remembered as one of the bloodiest days in American military history, when the wilderness itself seemed to catch fire with the fury of desperate men. At 5 o'clock in the morning, Grant ordered a general assault along the entire front. The plan was simple in concept but hellish in execution. Smash through Lee's thin defensive line before Confederate reinforcements could arrive. Major General Winfield Scott Hancock's 2nd Corps, the hammer of the Army of the Potomac, would deliver the killing blow along the Orange Plank Road. Hancock's men advanced through the pre-dawn darkness like a blue-clad avalanche. These were among the finest troops in the Union Army, veterans of Gettysburg and Antietam who had earned their reputation in blood. Their battle cry echoed through the woods as they struck Hill's exhausted 3rd Corps with devastating force. The Confederate line, stretched thin after a night of desperate fighting, began to crumble like a dam under too much pressure. For a brief moment, it seemed that Grant's gamble might pay off. Hill's men were falling back in confusion, their ammunition running low and their officers struggling to maintain any semblance of order. The road to Richmond lay open, and with it, perhaps the end of the war. But Robert E. Lee had not earned his reputation by accepting defeat, and help was racing through the morning mist in the form of Lieutenant General James Longstreet's 1st Corps. Longstreet, Lee's old war horse, had marched his men through the night from their positions near Gordonsville. His troops were exhausted but determined, knowing that the fate of the Confederacy might hang on their ability to plug the gap in Lee's line. They arrived just as Hill's position was on the verge of complete collapse, their gray uniforms appearing like ghosts through the morning fog. The collision between Hancock's advancing Federals and Longstreet's fresh Confederates was titanic in its violence. Men fought hand-to-hand among the trees, using rifle butts and bayonets when their ammunition ran out. The forest floor became slick with blood, and the air filled with the screams of wounded men and the crash of falling timber as artillery shells shattered ancient oaks. According to historical documentation from the American Battlefield Trust, the intensity of the fighting was such that the very forest began to burn, ignited by muzzle flashes and exploding shells in the tinder-dry underbrush. The fire spread with terrifying rapidity, turning the wilderness into a literal inferno. Wounded men who could not crawl to safety were consumed by the flames, their screams adding a new horror to an already nightmarish battle. Both armies were forced to detail precious manpower to fighting the fires, even as they continued to tear each other apart with rifle and cannon. At approximately 11 o'clock in the morning, disaster struck the Confederate cause. James Longstreet, reconnoitering near the front lines, was struck down by bullets fired by his own men in the confusion of the burning forest. The general who had argued against the charge at Gettysburg was carried from the field with a severe wound to his throat. His command structure shattered just as his troops were gaining momentum. The loss of Longstreet created a crisis in Confederate command that rippled through the entire army. Without their trusted leader, the First Corps' attack faltered, giving Hancock's bloodied but unbroken men time to reorganize their defenses. The moment of Confederate opportunity had passed, perhaps taking with it the South's last realistic chance for military victory. Lee himself was forced to ride forward to rally his troops, his presence inspiring the men but also exposing the Confederate commander to deadly risk. The sight of their beloved general so close to the fighting galvanized the Confederate soldiers, who redoubled their efforts despite the impossible odds. The battle raged on through the afternoon, neither side able to gain a decisive advantage in the burning wilderness. As evening approached, both armies remained locked in a deadly embrace among the charred trees and smoking undergrowth. The wilderness had become a monument to American courage and American tragedy, where brothers fought brothers in a forest that seemed to burn with the very passion of their convictions. As darkness fell on May 6th, the wilderness took on the aspect of Dante's vision of hell. The forest fires continued to burn throughout the night, casting an eerie orange glow that illuminated scenes of unimaginable carnage. The moans of wounded men echoed through the darkness, punctuated by the crack of burning timber and the occasional rifle shot as nervous pickets fired at shadows. Both armies huddled in their hastily constructed earthworks, exhausted soldiers trying to snatch moments of sleep while remaining alert for night attacks. The men had been fighting for 2 days in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance, and many were approaching the breaking point. Ammunition was running low on both sides, and the thick smoke from the fires made breathing difficult. Grant spent the night pacing the grounds around his headquarters, his cigar glowing like a beacon in the darkness. Dispatches arrived throughout the night, each one painting a grimmer picture of the battle's toll. The Army of the Potomac had suffered over 17,000 casualties in 2 days of fighting, losses that would have caused previous Union generals to retreat across the Rapidan River. But Grant was not previous Union generals. At dawn on May 7th, the third day of battle, an event occurred that would become legendary in American military history. Instead of ordering a retreat, Grant issued orders for the Army to move south, toward Spotsylvania Courthouse. The decision sent shockwaves through the Union ranks, where soldiers had grown accustomed to retreating after bloody encounters with Lee's army. When the men of the Army of the Potomac realized they were advancing rather than retreating, they broke into spontaneous cheers that echoed through the burned forest. For the first time in the war, a Union general was maintaining the offensive after a brutal encounter with Robert E. Lee. The psychological impact was enormous, signaling to both armies that this campaign would be different from all that had come before. Lee, meanwhile, faced his own moment of decision. His army had fought magnificently, but the losses had been severe. Major General J.E.B. Stuart, the cavalry commander whose reconnaissance had been crucial to Confederate success, was absent, having been sent to counter a Union cavalry raid toward Richmond. Without Stuart's eyes and ears, Lee was operating partially blind in a campaign where information was crucial. The final day of the Battle of the Wilderness was marked by sporadic fighting as both armies maneuvered for position. Neither side could claim a decisive victory in the traditional sense, but both had learned valuable lessons about their opponents. Grant had discovered that Lee's army, while still formidable, was no longer the invincible force it had once been. Lee had learned that in Grant, he faced a different kind of opponent, one who would not be deterred by heavy casualties or tactical setbacks. The human cost of the 3-day battle was staggering. The Union Army suffered approximately 18,000 casualties, while Confederate losses were estimated at around 11,000. In percentage terms, both armies had lost nearly 15% of their effective strength in a battle that had resolved nothing strategically but had demonstrated the terrible arithmetic of modern warfare. Perhaps most tragically, the forest fires had claimed victims from both sides who were too wounded to escape the flames. The exact number of men who died in this horrible manner would never be known, but their fate added an element of horror to a battle already marked by unprecedented violence. The burning of the wilderness became a metaphor for the consuming nature of the war itself, devouring everything in its path. As the smoke cleared on the morning of May 8th, Both armies began the grim task of burying their dead and caring for their wounded. The wilderness had tested the will of both North and South, and while neither could claim victory, both had demonstrated a level of courage and determination that would be remembered for generations. The battle was over, but the war would continue, with both sides knowing that even greater trials lay ahead. The aftermath of the Battle of the Wilderness revealed a landscape transformed by violence into something unrecognizable. Where once dense forests had stood, only charred stumps and smoldering ashes remained. The acrid smell of burned wood and worse things lingered in the air, a constant reminder of the horror that had unfolded in this Virginia wilderness. Burial details from both armies worked through May 8th and 9th, the grim task made more difficult by the condition of many bodies. The forest fires had burned so intensely that in some areas, identification was impossible. Union and Confederate soldiers found themselves working side by side in an unspoken truce, their shared humanity transcending the politics that had brought them to this place of death. Captain Henry N. Blake of the 11th Massachusetts Infantry wrote in his diary that the scene defied description. Bodies lay twisted among the burned trees, some still clutching their rifles, others reaching toward help that had never come. The captain noted that many of the dead showed signs of having fought with desperate courage to the end, their faces set in expressions of determination that death had not erased. The wounded presented an even more heartbreaking sight. Makeshift hospitals had been established in clearings throughout the area, where surgeons worked by candlelight to save what lives they could. The lack of proper medical supplies meant that many procedures were performed with instruments that would have been considered primitive even by the standards of the time. Amputation was often the only option for shattered limbs, and the piles of severed arms and legs outside the surgical tents bore testimony to the battle's toll. Among the Confederate wounded was Lieutenant General James Longstreet, whose injury would keep him from active duty for months. The loss of Lee's most trusted subordinate at such a critical moment in the war represented a blow to Confederate morale that extended far beyond mere military considerations. Longstreet had been the steady hand that Lee relied upon in moments of crisis, and his absence would be felt in the battles to come. The psychological impact of the battle was perhaps even more significant than the physical casualties. For 3 years, the Army of the Potomac had been conditioned to retreat after bloody encounters with Lee's forces. The decision to continue the offensive sent a clear message to both armies. This campaign would be fought to a conclusion, regardless of the cost. Private Elisha Hunt Rhodes of the 2nd Rhode Island Infantry captured the mood of many Union soldiers when he wrote to his family that General Grant had done something no previous commander had achieved. He had refused to be intimidated by Robert E. Lee. The men sensed that they were part of something different, a campaign that might finally bring the war to an end. The Confederate Army faced its own morale challenges. While the men maintained their faith in Lee's leadership, the losses among experienced officers were becoming critical. The Army of Northern Virginia had been built around a cadre of professional soldiers who had learned their trade in the old army, and each battle depleted this irreplaceable resource. Junior officers were being promoted to fill gaps, but experience could not be manufactured overnight. Logistical problems also plagued both sides. The Union Army's supply trains had been severely disrupted by the confused fighting, and ammunition shortages had affected the battle's outcome. Confederate supply problems were even more severe, as the South's weakened industrial base struggled to meet the Army's needs. Many Confederate soldiers were fighting with captured Union equipment, a situation that highlighted the disparity in resources between the two sides. The civilian population of the region suffered tremendously during and after the battle. Families who had lived in the wilderness for generations found their homes destroyed and their livelihoods ruined. Many became refugees, joining the streams of displaced persons that the war had created throughout Virginia. The battle had demonstrated that in this conflict, there was no true sanctuary for non-combatants. As both armies prepared to resume their deadly dance at Spotsylvania Courthouse, the lessons of the wilderness began to sink in. Grant had proven that he would not be deterred by heavy casualties, while Lee had shown that his army, though weakened, remained capable of inflicting severe punishment on any opponent. The stage was set for a campaign that would test both armies to their absolute limits. The Battle of the Wilderness concluded not with victory parades or surrender ceremonies, but with the quiet determination of exhausted armies preparing for the next round of their deadly contest. As the two forces disengaged and moved toward their next confrontation at Spotsylvania Courthouse, both North and South began to grapple with the implications of what had occurred in those burning woods. For Ulysses S. Grant, The wilderness represented both vindication and sobering education. His decision to continue the offensive after such devastating losses marked a turning point in Union strategy. Previous commanders had treated Lee's army as an invincible force to be avoided whenever possible. Grant had proven that Lee could be fought and, more importantly, that he could be hurt. The Confederate army had given as good as it got, but it had not been able to force another Union retreat across the Rapidan River. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. Grant's persistence signaled to the political leadership in Washington that military victory was achievable, even at a tremendous cost. President Lincoln, who had endured 3 years of disappointment from his generals, finally had a commander who understood that the war could only be won through relentless pressure on Confederate forces. Robert E. Lee faced a more complex calculation. His army had fought magnificently under impossible conditions, but the mathematics of attrition were inexorable. Every Confederate casualty was irreplaceable, while Grant could draw upon the vast manpower reserves of the North. Lee's tactical brilliance had not been enough to overcome the fundamental disparity in resources between the two sides. The battle's impact on Confederate morale was profound but complex. On one hand, the men had proven they could still fight the Yankees to a standstill even when outnumbered 2-1. On the other hand, the loss of key officers like Longstreet and the failure to achieve a decisive victory raised questions about the South's ability to continue the struggle. The Army of Northern Virginia remained a formidable fighting force, but it was clearly a wasting asset. The human cost of the battle resonated throughout American society. Newspapers in both North and South struggled to convey the magnitude of the casualties to their readers. The New York Tribune's coverage emphasized the heroic determination of Union forces, while Richmond papers praised the Confederate Army's defensive prowess. Both sides' press coverage reflected a growing awareness that the war had entered a new and more terrible phase. Families throughout the nation received the dreaded telegrams and letters that informed them of their loved ones' fates. The wilderness had claimed victims from every state in the Union and every corner of the Confederacy. Entire communities went into mourning as the casualty lists were published, and the personal tragedies behind the statistics became impossible to ignore. The battle also marked a technological turning point in American warfare. The use of entrenchments and the terrible effectiveness of rifled firearms in close combat foreshadowed the trench warfare that would dominate conflicts later in the century. Military observers noted how quickly both armies had adapted to fighting in dense terrain, improvising tactics that would influence military doctrine for decades to come. Perhaps most significantly, the Battle of the Wilderness demonstrated the transformation of American society under the pressure of total war. Both armies had shown a willingness to accept casualties that would have been unthinkable at the war's beginning. The conflict had evolved from a limited political dispute into a struggle for national survival that would accept no compromise. The burned forests of the wilderness became a symbol of the war's consuming nature. Just as the fires had devoured everything in their path, the conflict itself was destroying the America that had existed before 1861. From the ashes of that destruction, a new nation would eventually emerge, but the cost would be measured in ways that extended far beyond military casualties. As Grant's army marched south toward Spotsylvania, and Lee's forces moved to intercept them, both sides carried with them the lessons of the wilderness. The battle had proven that American soldiers, whether they wore blue or gray, possessed a capacity for sacrifice and endurance that even they had not fully understood. In the burning woods of Virginia, they had tested their nation's will and found it unbreakable, even as they discovered that the price of preserving the Union would be higher than anyone had dared imagine. The Battle of the Wilderness had ended, but its legacy would burn in American memory long after the last of the forest fires had been extinguished. It stood as a testament to the terrible cost of civil war and the unshakable determination of a people who would rather die than surrender their vision of what America should become.